It began with a promise of relief, but ended in a hail of bullets. In late May of 2025, the United States Department of State announced a $30 million funding initiative for a new humanitarian channel in Gaza, one that would bypass alleged corruption and diversion by militant actors and funnel food directly to civilians through a controlled aid architecture. The result was the creation of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, an American-backed organization that quickly established 4 key food distribution sites across the enclave. Publicly, the move was framed as a joint solution between Israeli authorities and Washington, a way to minimize Hamas interference and increase transparency in aid flows to starving Palestinians. But within weeks, these distribution zones had earned a different name among locals: death corridors. By the end of July, over 800 Palestinians had been killed near the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites. Thousands more were injured. Entire families torn apart by the chaos that unfolded where they had once expected help. At the core of the issue is not just food, but control. Humanitarian aid in a conflict zone is never neutral. It is always shaped by the military and political conditions on the ground. When aid becomes embedded in a battlefield, it ceases to be merely logistical and instead becomes strategic. That is what has happened in Gaza. The 4 GHF sites were placed under Israeli-approved supervision, in coordination with United States oversight, and designed to circumvent United Nations channels that Israeli officials argued were compromised. However, the humanitarian infrastructure was not accompanied by adequate security corridors, crowd control protocols, or even basic safeguards for population movement. Instead, tens of thousands of starving Palestinians were forced to walk for miles through bombed-out terrain, under surveillance, with Israeli troops stationed nearby, and no clearly demarcated safe zones. When masses gathered at dawn, hoping to secure food for their families, the result was often chaos. In some cases, stampedes erupted. In others, gunfire. Israeli defense forces have admitted to firing warning shots in response to what they called perceived threats. But videos verified by multiple independent outlets, including ABC News and the Red Cross, depict unarmed civilians running from bursts of fire, with bodies left sprawled on dusty roads near food trucks. On one morning in early June, a 13-year-old girl named Tak witnessed her mother, Ree, shot and killed while attempting to approach a distribution site. The scene was not exceptional. According to United Nations reports, more than 1,000 Palestinians have died trying to access food since the GHF system was activated. That statistic is more than just a number. It is an indictment of a system that appears to have collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Israel insists it is facilitating aid, but claims Hamas is obstructing it, loading trucks, and weaponizing hunger to provoke international sympathy. Hamas, in turn, accuses Israel of using food as leverage, denying basic supplies, while then presenting the GHF scheme as a humanitarian gesture, backed by the very superpower that supplies Israel with weapons. Caught between these narratives are children like 6-month-old Zanab Abu Halib, severely malnourished, and 4-year-old Razan Abu Sahir, who died days after being filmed in a central Gaza hospital, too weak to survive the delay in food and care. The breakdown is not just physical, it is systemic. Aid agencies, including the United Nations, have refused to cooperate with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's method of distribution, citing its proximity to military activity and its fundamental breach of humanitarian neutrality. Yet the Foundation insists it has already delivered over 91 million meals. Its leadership argues that halting operations would only make the situation worse. That war creates risk. and that aid must continue regardless. But the deeper issue is this. When a humanitarian corridor becomes a contested zone, when every loaf of bread becomes a symbol of allegiance or resistance, then food is no longer sustenance. It is a weapon. And in Gaza, that weapon is now drawing blood. The question is no longer just who is feeding whom. It is at what cost. In the next segment, we examine how the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation became the centerpiece of a geopolitical struggle far beyond the borders of the Strip, and why this aid architecture, designed by Washington, may have become a liability in the battle for influence in the Middle East, feeding the starved, fueling the fire, the Gaza aid crisis, and global consequences. Voiceover formatted, cold logic tone continued. To understand the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, one must understand what preceded it. For years, the primary delivery of aid into Gaza was channeled through large international networks. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the World Food Program, the Red Crescent, and dozens of smaller non-governmental organizations. Their access depended on Israeli security approvals and, at times, was subject to intense political pressure. But they operated with a shared principle: neutrality. Their mandate was to serve civilians, not governments, not armed groups. That model, however imperfect, maintained a semblance of balance until it was deemed no longer viable. Following the escalation of hostilities between Israel and Hamas in late 2023, Israeli intelligence began publicizing alleged evidence that humanitarian aid was being systematically diverted by Hamas operatives. Food trucks were rerouted, supplies repurposed, medical equipment stored in civilian facilities allegedly used as cover for militant infrastructure. These allegations, never fully substantiated, were enough to alter Washington's approach. By early 2024, senior officials in the United States National Security Council began discussing alternative aid frameworks, ones that could both feed Palestinians and satisfy Israeli security demands. The result was the conceptualization of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, not a neutral actor, but a controlled mechanism, publicly described as independent. Privately, the Foundation's leadership maintained direct communication with both Israeli and American military liaison officers. Its sites were pre-approved by Israel's coordinator of government activities in the territories, and staffed in part by personnel vetted for security purposes. Its funding came from the United States State Department, and its public messaging emphasized efficiency, throughput, and measurable impact. But what the metrics did not show was what happened outside the camera frame. The aid trucks arrived, but the crowds were unfiltered. Desperate civilians with no access to transport were forced to walk through rubble-filled zones, past armed checkpoints, under drones, into open fields with no shade, no order, and no protection. There were no biometric systems to stagger arrivals, no registration platforms to prioritize the sick or the elderly. Only the most desperate and the most mobile had a chance. And that is where the design failed. The Foundation had modeled its aid system on logistics frameworks used in earthquake zones, where roads are impassable, but where violence is not systemic. Gaza, however, is not a natural disaster site. It is a battlefield. In such an environment, the line between humanitarian logistics and military operations is dangerously thin. And when armed forces are placed in close proximity to aid distribution zones, the risk of escalation becomes inevitable. That is precisely what unfolded in early June. At the Nasser hospital, just days after the GHF system launched, casualties arrived in waves. Dozens of gunshot wounds. Victims as young as 10 years old. Witnesses reported Israeli snipers firing from nearby rooftops. claiming to be responding to perceived threats. Yet video evidence showed unarmed civilians carrying sacks of flour caught in crossfire. Some were shot in the back, others while lying on the ground. The Israeli military later acknowledged it had engaged from a distance, but denied targeting civilians deliberately. Its official statement read, "The soldiers responded to actions that endangered their safety." But the broader question was not about intent. It was about consequence. If a food distribution site repeatedly produces death, it ceases to function as a humanitarian node. It becomes, by definition, a combat zone. This reality has had far-reaching effects. Major humanitarian actors have suspended participation in the GHF-led network. The United Nations called it coercive and non-compliant with international humanitarian norms. Red Crescent officials described it as a first-come, first-bleed competition, a phrase meant to underscore how aid seekers were being exposed to lethal risk merely by queuing. But the foundation remained operational. Its executive chairman, when interviewed in early June, was visibly defensive. He rejected the idea that his system was responsible for deaths. He stated plainly, "The deaths are happening in the Gaza Strip because it is a war, not because we are distributing food." In strategic terms, his statement was not wrong, but it was incomplete. In war zones, decisions have second and third-order effects. Designing an aid architecture without accounting for the behaviors of armed actors, or the desperation of starving civilians, is not neutral. It is reckless. The United States government, in pushing for this model, also made a strategic calculation. It sought to prove that aid could be delivered without empowering Hamas, that civilians could be fed without Hamas profiting from it, and that Washington, in partnership with Israel, could establish a new humanitarian paradigm in the Middle East. But in doing so, it made the fatal assumption that visibility equals legitimacy. That data on meals distributed could outweigh the reality of bloodshed at the point of delivery. It also underestimated how swiftly global perception could turn. The imagery emerging from Gaza, children dying in the sand, mothers collapsing near food trucks, hospitals overflowing with bodies from aid sites, has already begun to erode the moral high ground Washington claimed in the initial rollout of the GHF initiative. And in capitals across the Middle East, the question is being asked quietly. If this is how the United States delivers aid, what does that say about its vision for peace? In the next section, we shift focus to the diplomatic consequences of the GHF fallout and how competing powers from Tehran to Ankara, from Moscow to Beijing, are using the Gaza aid crisis to reshape regional alliances. Feeding the starved, fueling the fire, the Gaza aid crisis and global consequences. Voiceover formatted, cold logic tone continued. As images from Gaza flooded the global media cycle, the political reverberations were not confined to the Strip. They spread outward, across diplomatic corridors in Europe, in Arab capitals, and into the strategy rooms of America's competitors. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was not merely a logistical experiment. It was a symbol, a test of whether the United States could reshape the humanitarian framework of an active conflict zone without the involvement of multilateral institutions. But as the body count rose, that symbol became toxic. For regional powers long skeptical of United States hegemony in the Middle East, the collapse of GHF's legitimacy served as confirmation that American-led solutions were no longer trusted, even when dressed in humanitarian garb. Iran, whose strategic alignment with Hamas is long-standing, used the chaos to amplify its own narrative. State media in Tehran aired back-to-back footage of wounded children in Gaza, accusing the United States and Israel of conducting what they called engineered starvation. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei issued a rare direct statement, framing the Gaza aid system as part of a broader Western war on Islam. His words resonated not only in Iran, but also in parts of Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen, where Iranian proxies used the narrative to rally domestic support. In Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan seized on the humanitarian optics. His government condemned the killings near the aid sites, framing them as proof that the international community must restore multilateral oversight to Gaza relief operations. Privately, Turkish diplomats began re-engaging with United Nations agencies to expand Ankara's role in regional aid governance, positioning Turkey as a neutral but influential player, able to reach both Palestinians and international donors. In Moscow, the Kremlin exploited the information space with surgical precision. Russian state media highlighted inconsistencies in American messaging, contrasting President Trump's declaration of humanitarian intent with the realities on the ground: dead civilians and collapsing hospitals. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, in a joint press conference with his Syrian counterpart, declared the GHF model an imperial project disguised as aid. He warned that the West's use of humanitarian tools for political ends risked igniting broader instability in the region. China, while more restrained in tone, also signaled disapproval. At the United Nations Security Council, Beijing's ambassador abstained from a resolution supporting expanded GHF funding and later issued a carefully worded statement calling for neutral, coordinated, and multilateral aid structures free from military interference. This was not merely rhetoric. It was strategy. China's Belt and Road investments in the Middle East depend on long-term regional stability. An unstable Gaza, dominated by polarizing aid mechanisms, is a liability. And the more that instability is linked to American fingerprints, the more China can offer itself as a countermodel, one that emphasizes infrastructure, not interference. In Arab capitals, the response was more complex, but equally revealing. In Jordan, a country that has long walked the tightrope between alliance with the West and solidarity with the Palestinian cause, officials expressed private concern. The royal court received direct warnings from tribal leaders along the Jordan River Valley, citing rising outrage over the death toll at GHF sites. In Egypt, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi maintained formal silence. But security officials in Cairo quietly ramped up border monitoring, fearing that images of the Gaza aid crisis could trigger unrest in the Sinai Peninsula, where anti-government sentiment remains volatile. Even in Saudi Arabia, a close ally of the United States, public discourse on state-controlled media began to shift. Anchors referred to the GHF controversy as a miscalculation by Washington. And clerics in Mecca and Medina delivered Friday sermons calling for real aid, not strategic theater. The diplomatic damage was not merely reputational. It was operational. Several countries began re-evaluating their participation in United States-led humanitarian initiatives. Norway withdrew its technical advisors from a cross-border logistics team supporting GHF data collection. Germany suspended its in-kind contribution of solar-powered refrigeration units intended for future GHF sites. France called for an independent inquiry into the deaths near the distribution corridors. But perhaps the most consequential shift came from within the United Nations. A senior official at the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, speaking on condition of anonymity, stated that the GHF experiment had created an unbridgeable trust gap between field operators and Western diplomats. No one wants to be associated with a model that puts children in the line of fire, he said. It is not a question of politics anymore, it is a question of ethics. And yet, despite the growing backlash, the GHF operations continued. The logic, as articulated by its executive team, remained unchanged. If aid is halted, starvation spreads. If aid continues, casualties may rise. There is no perfect system in war. But as the weeks passed, It became increasingly clear that the choice between those two options was not a binary one, that other models existed. That coordination with established neutral actors was not only possible, but necessary. And as that realization set in, so too did a more troubling question for Washington's foreign policy architects. If the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a model built on American funds, Israeli approval, and Western logistical standards, could not avoid becoming a flashpoint, then what does that say about the United States' capacity to manage post-conflict stabilization in far more complex environments? In the next part, we will explore how this failure reflects a deeper erosion in America's soft power architecture, and what it may signal for future engagements in Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. Soft power was once Washington's most reliable currency. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States did not just project power through military bases or aircraft carriers. It rebuilt Europe through the Marshall Plan, exported values through Peace Corps missions, and stabilized post-colonial regions through institutions like USAID and the Bretton Woods system. Even during the Cold War, humanitarian engagement served as a counterweight to hard power. Food drops in Berlin, medical convoys in Southeast Asia, vaccination campaigns across Africa. This was not charity. It was strategy. A well-fed population was less susceptible to ideological subversion. A functioning civil society meant a weaker insurgency. The delivery of aid was a signal, one that said, America shows up and it stays. But that signal has been weakening. In recent years, the United States has gradually outsourced large portions of its humanitarian footprint. Private contractors, hybrid consortia, intelligence-vetted logistics firms. The motivations have varied: risk aversion, bureaucratic inertia, political optics. But the result is clear. America now delivers aid with a more transactional logic, one that is measurable in short-term impact, but vulnerable to long-term distrust. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation embodies this transformation. Rather than working through United Nations channels, or partnering with neutral NGOs embedded in the Palestinian community, the United States chose to fund and help design a bespoke organization, one tightly aligned with Israeli security architecture. Its stated purpose was to circumvent Hamas. Its real effect was to marginalize existing humanitarian actors and fracture the principle of neutrality that has long underpinned aid diplomacy. In doing so, Washington abandoned a tool of influence that had been years in the making. Soft power does not function when its carriers are seen as partial. It does not resonate when food convoys are escorted by armed drones. And it does not inspire trust when the very act of queuing for bread becomes a death sentence. The erosion of American credibility in Gaza is not confined to one organization. It is symptomatic of a broader pattern, one that now extends across multiple theaters of operation. In Lebanon, where the United States once helped fund schools and water infrastructure through multilateral partners, local civil society groups have begun rejecting direct United States grants, citing increased political risk and reduced local ownership. In Syria, attempts to deliver cross-border aid to opposition-held areas have become entangled in accusations of selective delivery, with Russia and Iran exploiting every lapse in coverage as evidence of geopolitical bias. Even in Iraq, a country where billions of dollars in United States aid have been poured since 2003, trust remains fragile. A recent survey conducted by a European think tank found that more than 70% of Iraqis in southern provinces believe foreign aid serves the interests of foreign governments, not the Iraqi people. In this context, the Gaza aid crisis is not an outlier. It is a case study. A moment when the failure of one initiative illuminated the decay of an entire doctrine. And yet, despite these warning signs, there remains a disconnect between the narratives emerging on the ground. and the messaging deployed from Washington. United States officials continue to emphasize metrics. 91 million meals delivered. 220,000 families reached. Hundreds of trucks cleared through Israeli checkpoints. But these numbers, however accurate, do not tell the whole story. They do not account for who did not make it to the aid lines. They do not measure the psychological toll on children who watch their parents die in search of food. They do not reflect the geopolitical capital that has been burned, nor the alliances that have begun to fray. This is not simply a communications failure. It is a strategic blind spot. For every casualty at a food site, a new narrative is born, one that America's adversaries are all too ready to exploit. For every refusal by the United Nations to participate in GHF operations, another crack appears in the facade of Western-led coordination. In this sense, the Gaza aid crisis may come to represent a pivot point, not just for humanitarian strategy, but for the way the United States is perceived in the global South. In Africa, South Asia, Latin America, where memories of colonization are still raw, where neutrality in global conflicts is often prized above allegiance. The idea of a militarized food delivery system, sponsored by the United States, feeds skepticism. It reinforces the perception that Western powers do not deliver aid. They deploy it. And when aid becomes indistinguishable from coercion, soft power dies. What replaces it is something far less predictable. A world of shifting loyalties, transactional alignments, and a vacuum of trust. In the next section, we will analyze how that vacuum is already being filled not only by adversaries, but by alternative aid models emerging from non-Western blocs, and what that means for the future of humanitarian legitimacy on the global stage. Feeding the starved, fueling the fire, the Gaza aid crisis and global consequences. Voiceover formatted, cold logic tone continued. In diplomacy, as in physics, a vacuum will not remain unfilled. As American-led humanitarian credibility declines, a new wave of actors has begun to reshape the aid landscape. They are not necessarily driven by altruism, but by alignment. What is emerging is not a global consensus, but a patchwork of parallel systems, in which aid flows reflect spheres of influence, not shared values. One need only look at how certain governments have responded to the Gaza food crisis to see the contours of this shift. Qatar, a longtime patron of Hamas, announced in early July that it would launch its own independent food relief corridor into Gaza, funded entirely through its Red Crescent arm, and with minimal coordination with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Its approach was quietly supported by Turkey, which dispatched mobile kitchens and field hospitals through Turkish NGOs, circumventing the Israeli approval process by operating primarily in Hamas-controlled zones and leveraging its own security assurances through back-channel diplomacy. Both countries framed their efforts not just as humanitarian, but as restorative, a way to restore dignity, to aid without conditions, to remove the perception of subjugation that now clings to every meal delivered under the GHF umbrella. At the same time, China began expanding its logistical footprint through its Belt and Road Humanitarian Branch, the China International Development Cooperation Agency. In late June, shipments of rice, powdered milk, and water purification units arrived at Egypt's Rafah border crossing, marked not with logos of international NGOs, but with the Chinese national flag. Beijing made no public announcements, but the message was understood. While others deliver aid with surveillance drones and military escorts, China delivers quietly and strategically. Moscow followed suit in its own fashion. Through a combination of the Russian Emergencies Ministry and Orthodox-affiliated NGOs, Russia began shipping food parcels to Gaza through Syrian and Lebanese intermediaries. Though limited in quantity, the move served a dual purpose. It reinforced Moscow's image as a counterweight to the Western alliance, and it allowed Russia to project soft power into an Arab context without deploying formal military assets. This alternative aid architecture is still fragmented, but it is gaining coherence. It operates on a principle the West once claimed for itself: trust through distance. These actors do not attempt to engineer the governance of the areas they serve. They do not insist on political reforms as a prerequisite for food. They position their aid as reciprocal, not supervisory. And while that model brings its own risks, particularly the risk of legitimizing armed groups or weakening institutional norms, it is, for now, resonating more deeply in some corners of the global South than the GHF's coercive approach. There is also a resurgence of South-South cooperation. In early July, Indonesia and Malaysia jointly sponsored a humanitarian flotilla carrying rice and medical supplies. Its port of entry was coordinated through Hamas channels, a decision that drew condemnation from Israel and silence from the United States. But for much of Southeast Asia, the message was not about provocation. It was about principle. That Palestinians should not be forced to choose between safety and sustenance. That humanitarian access should not be militarized. And that neutral aid can still exist if the will to protect it remains. This is where the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation stands most exposed. Not just because of its operational failures, but because of the contrast it now presents between an aid model built on oversight, control, and exclusion, and a rising counter-model based on cultural affinity, local coordination, and trust. The consequences of this divergence extend far beyond Gaza. If American-backed humanitarian mechanisms are increasingly viewed as coercive or partial, then Washington risks losing more than moral authority. It risks forfeiting its place at the table when future crises unfold. Already, in forums ranging from the African Union to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, discussions are underway to develop regional disaster relief protocols that bypass Western-dominated channels. The rationale is simple. If aid can be weaponized, it can also be nationalized. This trend is being amplified by advancements in digital infrastructure. Blockchain-based food tracking systems, decentralized donor platforms, real-time beneficiary verification through mobile apps. Much of this technology is being piloted outside the Western Hemisphere. In Kenya, Rwanda, Bangladesh, and even in parts of Latin America. And increasingly, with funding from non-traditional donors, including China, the United Arab Emirates, and regional development banks. What is emerging is a multipolar aid world. And in that world, the Gaza crisis is a tipping point. A moment when the monopoly of Western humanitarian legitimacy begins to fracture, not through ideology, but through mismanagement. And it raises a fundamental question. If aid is no longer universally trusted, and if every convoy becomes a symbol of alignment, then how can neutrality survive? In the next part, we will turn inward and examine how the Gaza fallout is reshaping internal debates within the United States itself, from Capitol Hill to the Pentagon, and what it reveals about Washington's ability to adapt to 21st century humanitarian conflict. In Washington, the fallout from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is beginning to seep into domestic political discourse. It is not yet a scandal, but it is a stress fracture, one that reveals deeper tensions between America's strategic ambitions and its capacity to manage moral complexity in a multipolar world. On Capitol Hill, the divide is most visible along ideological lines, but it is not strictly partisan. Among establishment Republicans, there is broad support for the GHF's underlying goal: to prevent Hamas from weaponizing aid. For these lawmakers, the deaths at food distribution sites are tragic, but not disqualifying. They argue that the price of humanitarian access in a war zone is inherently high, and that halting operations would hand Hamas a propaganda victory. But among libertarian-leaning conservatives, there is unease. Senators aligned with non-interventionist platforms have questioned the wisdom of placing American aid workers in volatile areas and have called for a full audit of how GHF contracts were awarded. One senior senator described the foundation as a ghost operation with real-world consequences, referring to its rapid creation, opaque funding structure, and reliance on military coordination. On the Democratic side, the fractures run deeper. Progressive lawmakers have been openly critical of the GHF from the outset. Several members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee have demanded hearings not just on the Gaza operation, but on the broader shift in United States humanitarian policy away from multilateralism. They cite testimony from doctors operating in Gaza, who have treated patients riddled with gunshot wounds received near GHF distribution zones, and they argue that the current model undermines both ethics and effectiveness. Mainstream Democrats are more cautious. They acknowledge the rising death toll, but continue to emphasize the importance of preventing Hamas from diverting resources. For them, the Gaza aid experiment is a dilemma, not a failure. But even among moderates, there is growing pressure to recalibrate. Several influential think tanks, including the Carnegie Endowment and the Council on Foreign Relations, have released policy memos urging a pivot back toward partnership with the United Nations and vetted NGOs. Their core argument is not moral. It is strategic. The United States cannot afford to be the face of militarized humanitarianism, especially in regions where it seeks to retain influence against rising powers like China. Inside the Pentagon, the tone is more clinical, but no less concerned. Military planners understand that humanitarian operations in kinetic zones must be designed with both de-escalation and deniability in mind. The current model provides neither. Satellite imagery, open-source video, and drone footage have made it virtually impossible to separate aid operations from military optics. And when casualties mount in close proximity to American-backed sites, even if United States troops are not involved, the perception of complicity is almost guaranteed. Defense officials have also raised alarms about the sustainability of the GHF model. Crowd surges, sniper incidents, and recurring stampedes have forced repeated evacuations and temporary shutdowns. This undermines not only mission continuity, but operational credibility. There are also long-term implications. Every incident that ends in civilian death further erodes the trust needed to execute future stability operations. Whether in Gaza, Sudan, or any other fragile state, the intelligence community has echoed these concerns. Classified assessments reportedly shared with the National Security Council suggest that the backlash to the GHF model is fueling radicalization. Online forums linked to extremist groups are already framing the aid deaths as proof of Western hypocrisy and using them to recruit young sympathizers across the region. None of this is theoretical. It is cause and effect. And yet, within the executive branch, the political calculus remains fraught. President Trump, having publicly backed the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation as a flagship example of American efficiency and resolve, is unlikely to reverse course. Any admission of failure would carry domestic political cost and could be weaponized by opponents as evidence of weakness. So instead, the administration is pursuing a containment strategy. It has ramped up press briefings highlighting GHF's food delivery statistics, deployed State Department spokespeople to deflect criticism by pointing to Hamas's role in destabilizing aid corridors, and leaned on allied media outlets to downplay the incidents as anomalies. But inside policy circles, the debate is intensifying. A growing number of voices are calling for a structural rethink, not just of the GHF, but of the entire American approach to aid in conflict zones. There is talk of re-establishing a humanitarian operations center within USAID, with direct oversight from civilian leadership. There are proposals for creating third-party verification teams comprised of neutral observers from non-aligned nations to monitor aid deliveries and certify compliance with international norms. These ideas are still in early stages, but they reflect a deeper recognition that the current path is unsustainable. The Gaza aid crisis has not just exposed a tactical flaw, it has triggered a strategic reckoning. And as that reckoning unfolds, the United States must decide what kind of humanitarian actor it wishes to be: a unilateral force with high velocity and high risk, or a collaborative leader that sacrifices speed for legitimacy. The choice may define not only its role in Gaza, but its standing in the global order. In the final part of this commentary, we will step back from the immediate crisis and examine the long-term geopolitical implications of the Gaza aid model for America's alliances, for humanitarian norms, and for the credibility of Western power in a fractured world. The Gaza aid crisis is not an isolated event. It is a signal that the traditional model of Western humanitarian intervention is fraying, under pressure from geopolitics, technology, and shifting norms of legitimacy. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was envisioned as a bold response to a difficult problem: how to deliver aid in a war zone without empowering an adversary. But in execution, it has revealed the structural limits of unilateral aid design. In an environment where control is contested and trust is scarce, at its core, the model failed not because it lacked resources or even intent. It failed because it prioritized oversight over access, security over neutrality, and visibility over credibility. And those failures now echo beyond Gaza. In Brussels, the European Union is reassessing its humanitarian protocols. A leaked internal briefing suggests that future partnerships with United States-led aid consortia may require explicit neutrality clauses, a subtle but pointed critique of militarized coordination models. In Geneva, the International Committee of the Red Cross has warned of a precedent in which aid operations embedded in security infrastructures lose their protective status under international law, turning distribution sites into de facto combat zones. In Nairobi, Addis Ababa, and Dhaka, humanitarian organizations are quietly revising their field protocols, preparing for a future where the lines between aid, influence, and intimidation continue to blur. And in Washington, strategists are now confronting a sobering question. If the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, with all its funding, planning, and international backing, can become a vector of instability, then how resilient is America's broader capacity to lead in crisis zones? The implications are stark. In Taiwan, where the specter of conflict looms larger with each passing year, United States planners are already sketching out civil resilience strategies. But if American aid models are seen as coercive, even the most robust logistical plans may be viewed with suspicion. In the Sahel, where Western militaries are retreating and Russian-backed mercenaries are advancing, the ability to deliver food, medicine, and infrastructure will define who fills the vacuum. If America's model continues to falter, others will fill the gap not with better ethics, but with fewer constraints. Even in Latin America, where migration corridors and drug violence intersect with humanitarian need, credibility matters. A border aid station staffed by Marines is not neutral, no matter how well stocked it may be. This is not to say that the United States must retreat from humanitarian leadership, but it must evolve. Soft power, once taken for granted, must now be re-earned. Through humility, not hubris. Through partnership, not performance. The age of the singular Western savior is over. What remains is a contest of systems, a test of whether the democratic world can still deliver solutions that do not escalate risk or degrade dignity. And in that test, Gaza is the proving ground. If children continue to die while reaching for bread, no metric of meals delivered will matter. No press release will erase the footage. No statement from the podium will repair the breach. Trust, once lost, is difficult to restore. But it is not impossible. The first step is acknowledgement, not of blame, but of design failure. The second is adaptation, an end to frameworks that treat civilians as variables, and aid as theater. The third is humility, a willingness to listen to those on the ground, even when their testimony contradicts the data. In the coming months, as Gaza's suffering continues, and the world watches with narrowing patience, the United States faces a choice: to double down on a broken model, or to rebuild one that works, quietly, inclusively, and credibly. Because in the end, humanitarian power is not about dominance. It is about restraint, and the ability to help without harm. That, above all, is what defines legitimacy. And legitimacy, in this age of contested influence, is the rarest power of all.